The Spider-Verse films tell the story of a young man on a journey to find himself. And while there's a long list of aspects of these films that are worth praising, like their stories, writing, comedy, and don't even get me started on the animation, I want to focus on the characters in these films, specifically the male ones. Because the Spider-Verse films are such a hit with young male audiences, due in large part to these male characters and how they're written. These films portray men as strong, confident, and powerful, but also relatable, insecure, and ultimately flawed, and use these characters to highlight themes that resonate with males from all age ranges. But to dive deeper, we'll be entering spoiler territory, so consider this a warning. And with that out of the way, let's discuss how the Spider-Verse writes men. And of course, who better to start a video like this than with Miles Morales, the main character. But who is Miles Morales? And that is a question surrounding this character in both films. Because in Into the Spider-Verse, we see the theme surrounding Miles is that he has huge potential, not just as a spider person, but as a human being. He's academically gifted and is a talented artist, but we see that his father worries about whether Miles is able to reach his potential. And this is reflected again when he meets the Spider People. While Peter B acknowledges Miles' potential, the others aren't so sure, focusing on what Miles lacks that they expect a spider person to have. Then in the next film, we're shown that even among the Spider People, Miles doesn't belong. He's treated as a burden, an anomaly by Miguel, Jess, and the others. He spent an entire film and more molding himself into an identity, and then he was told that becoming that identity was a mistake that never should have happened. In both Into and Across the Spider-Verse, Miles is being pushed and pulled 100 different directions. In his own words, people keep telling him how his story is supposed to go, and I think that's the part of Miles' story that resonates so much with male audiences. Because speaking as a young male myself, I think what's so relatable with Miles' struggles is how contradictory modern expectations have become for men. Because all of Miles' role models are contradictory to each other in some way. Jeff wants Miles to become the best version of himself, so he pushes him, while Aaron wants him to remain who he is, so he accepts him. Miguel believes that Spider-Man has to experience loss, and those canon events are what make Spider-Man, while Hobie completely rejects the concepts of labels entirely. And Peter B spent an entire film teaching Miles that anyone can be Spider-Man, and then completely goes against everything he taught him in the next film. But let me be clear, none of these characters are entirely wrong, and none of them are entirely right either. And I think that's just what growing up as a man in this day and age often feels like. For the longest time, the expectations for being a man were clear-cut. Men just had to manage their expectations, provide for the people they loved, and do the right thing, whatever that may be. But modern masculinity demands balance. Men are still expected to be emotionally resilient, but not distant. Vulnerable enough to feel human, but not emotionally dependent. Confident enough to inspire others, but not arrogant. Ambitious enough to have high standards for oneself, but not be consumed by that ambition to chase greed or status. And just like how in the first film we're taught that there's no such thing as a proper way to be Spider-Man, there's also no universal formula for what a healthy male looks like, because that will vary from person to person and culture to culture. And that's where Miles finds himself in these films. A young man with great expectations placed upon him by different people, pulling him all over the place. And they all think they're doing Miles a favor by helping him realize his identity, but who Miles is ultimately up to him to decide. I think it's beautiful that Miles' defining moment in both films are about him realizing that his identity is self-authored, and that while other people can help him on the way, it's up to him who he really wants to be. And I think that's just a moral that the films are trying to impart on its audience, especially young men. Because being an ideal man isn't about ascribing to someone else's view of whatever that happens to look like. It's about choosing to be a version of yourself that you're proud of and comfortable being. Because everybody is going to have expectations placed upon you, and you can't please everyone. Just like we see from this next character, Jeff. Police Lieutenant Jeff Morales is Miles' father and a cop. While he does try to be loving and present to his son, Miles, Jeff has been shown to also be an overbearing parent. He sees that Miles has a lot of potential and that his son is incredibly intelligent. However, he also finds himself disappointed in his son's choices constantly because he expects him to know better. But in a surprising scene in the second film, we see that Jeff actually opens up about his insecurities. After he and Spider-Man confront the Spot, he's visibly upset that they couldn't apprehend the villain. In the same scene, he talks about how he feels he's a disappointment, that no matter what he does, someone else always thinks he's blowing it, which says a lot about Jeff. It seems to me that this character has a lot of expectations placed upon him as a police lieutenant, soon to be captain, and that reflects in his relationship with his son. Because while he does push Miles to be better, Jeff's flaw as a character is that he only ever sees Miles' potential for what he can become and not for who he is today. Throughout both films, Jeff constantly pushes Miles to be better, placing him in a new school that he feels will help him reach his high standards, and then expects him to show up to a guidance session which will help him get into a college while he's still just a sophomore. That's a lot of pressure to be placing on someone who can't even legally drive a car yet. And Miles, as Spider-Man, actually subtly tells Jeff what he's doing wrong. Because of these great expectations, Miles is afraid of talking to his father, which is ironic because Jeff's fear is that he's alienating his son and would eventually lose him. And I think the way Miles wants to be treated by his dad is a way that a lot of modern men feel they wish to be treated as well. Because the current discourse surrounding men, especially online, has become rather extreme. On one hand, you have people who believe that men should return to traditional masculine ideals, and that if you don't, you're fundamentally flawed as a person. On the other, you have people who believe that men are inherently trash no matter what they do, while still claiming that they should do better. Now, both are extremes and neither should be listened to without a grain of salt, but I also think the way Jeff speaks to Miles in the second film shows how a lot of young men view the world is speaking to them. Jeff has all these expectations for Miles, but fundamentally he doesn't listen. He acknowledges that his son has been acting up, but instead of being curious why his son acts the way he does, he immediately condemns him. One of the few times he asks Miles what's going on, it's done publicly, and excuse the pun, puts him on the spot. Miles doesn't feel seen or heard by his own father, which understandably strains their relationship. While his father does have the right to be upset with Miles because the kid could have made more of an effort to show up on time and show some respect to his parents, I don't think yelling at Miles in public and embarrassing him in front of so many of their loved ones was a warranted reaction. And understandably, that caused Miles to avoid his parents rather than open up to them. And the fear of not being seen or heard isn't a problem that's unique to Miles. It's a very human fear. And men have this fear too, not because they have it uniquely worse than everyone else, but many of them feel that their struggles are interpreted as moral failings before they're fully understood. Loneliness, social anxiety, and insecurity aren't new problems, but they're growing increasingly common. When someone's first experience of opening up is being mocked, dismissed, or immediately told that all their problems are self-inflicted, they're less likely to even bother trying again. Men are growing increasingly afraid to be vulnerable, and that's a problem because a lot of things in life require vulnerability for men to function. To make friends, apply for a job, or approach women at a bar, a man has to be vulnerable in some way. But if a man doesn't feel safe to be vulnerable, he just won't do it. Because why even bother attempting conversation when there's a non-zero chance you'll be branded as a creep? But let me be clear, there's absolutely zero excuse to turn that loneliness or insecurity into hatred or negativity. But the truth is that a lot of young men feel alienated by society, causing them to seek affirmation from bad actors, exploiting those real, genuine vulnerabilities. And this is exactly what happens with Jeff and Miles, because while his dad wants to see Miles become better and recognize his potential, he doesn't understand that the process of becoming better takes time and failure. Miles is still, after all, just a kid. And because of this, he alienates his own son from him, and when he feels unseen and unheard, he looks for an alternative that makes him feel loved, even if they have questionable morals. And I'm of course talking about Uncle Aaron. Uncle Aaron is the opposite of his brother, because while Jeff is a family man who fights crime and wears a badge, Aaron is a man with no responsibilities and commits crimes as the Prowler. Aaron is fundamentally a bad influence on Miles. In one of the scenes they share, Miles tells his uncle that he has to leave so he can do his paper. Instead, Aaron convinces him to shirk his responsibilities so they can make some graffiti art. They enter a restricted area and even do so by scaling the fence. Now, it can be argued that graffiti and trespassing are victimless crimes, but the real question is, what is Aaron teaching Miles here? He's teaching him that his obligations can wait, that doing what feels good in the moment is more important than doing what's right, and that his sense of personal freedom is more important than the work that will help him grow. And that's what makes Aaron such a compelling character, because he doesn't challenge Miles to grow. He instead validates his immaturity, and for a teenager who feels judged by his father, being accepted can seem so much more attractive. And that's why Aaron can get Miles to listen in a way that Jeff simply can't. He doesn't begin by telling Miles what to think, he begins by making Miles feel understood. People are far more willing to accept guidance from someone who accepts them than from someone who constantly criticizes them. and that's what makes unhealthy mentors so persuasive. And in the context of modern men, that's why a lot of young men listen to self-proclaimed alpha male podcasters, because these influencers lure them in with the idea that if they listen to them, they will find community and they'll teach them how to attract women and be a better version of themselves, and they instead just impart their misogynistic views. They teach young men that women are the problem for having standards, that women having the right to work and vote should be up for debate, and that men are entitled to relationships even if women don't want to date them. But believing these views won't help young men get any dates. In fact, it just makes them so much more unattractive to women, because real self-improvement is so much harder. It requires accepting that you aren't perfect, and that social skills take practice, and that the process of growth is one that by design takes time. But online discourse often forgets this. For some young men, the fear of coming across as creepy is so overwhelming that they avoid putting themselves out altogether. Whether that fear is always justified isn't really the point. If someone believes every social mistake will be interpreted as a moral failing, they're less likely to develop the confidence and social skills that only come with experience. But going back to Spider-Verse, Aaron functions as Jeff's foil. They're opposites, so we can see how Miles interacts with two different kinds of characters. But there's actually another character that parallels Jeff, and that's Gwen's dad, Captain Stacy. Captain Stacy is the fixed version of Jeff's character, because like Jeff, Captain Stacy is a cop, and he focuses more on rules and his belief of what's right and wrong, rather than trying to understand his daughter. Because we see that while Gwen isn't afraid to give love to her father, their relationship is also somewhat strained, because Gwen hides from him her secret identity as Spider-Woman, while her father believes she is responsible for the death of her best friend, Peter Parker. And when Gwen loses her best friend, Captain Stacy doesn't really know how to comfort her. Instead, he goes straight into his work, trying to catch the woman he believes killed Peter. But what does he do when he finds out that the same woman is his own daughter? He points a gun at her and threatens to arrest his own flesh and blood. He's spent so much time trying to be a good captain that he's seemingly forgotten how to be just Gwen's dad. Much like how Jeff spends so much time trying to prepare Miles for adulthood that he forgets to foster a real relationship with him. But the beauty of Captain Stacy is that we see him change. When he sees his daughter again, after instinctively trying to arrest her, he reveals that he's left the force, and while the character is definitely upset that he kind of just gave up his job that has defined him for so long, he's undoubtedly proud of the decision because it means he chose his family, telling Gwen, "You're the best thing I've ever done," in an absolutely heartwarming scene. These films aren't saying that fathers shouldn't have expectations though. Instead, the Spider-Verse films are saying that those expectations should never matter more than the relationship. And that's just something that Jeff's gonna have to learn. Hopefully we see more of that in the next film, you know, if it ever comes out. But contrasting a character like Captain Stacy, who learns to let go of control, we move on to one that tries to control everything. Of course, I'm talking about Miguel O'Hara. Miguel in Across absolutely stole the show for me, as a secondary antagonist and as a male character specifically, because Miguel represents how a lot of men deal with guilt. As was shown in the second film, Miguel made the seemingly harmless decision to pull a Rick and Morty and replace his dead self from another dimension to be able to spend time with his family again. This gave him a first-hand experience of disrupting a so-called canon event, which he believes are core parts of a Spider-Person's story and required for them to become effective Spider People. By disrupting the canon of that universe, he caused a disturbance, creating a rift and seemingly causing the destruction of said reality. It's a heartbreaking backstory, because to Miguel, he wasn't hurting anyone by taking the place of his dead self, but that little oopsie killed billions of people. And his response is to establish the Spider Society, a task force that keeps the canon intact across dimensions, preventing yet another death of an entire reality. This is seemingly a healthy way to channel his grief, to prevent others from making the same mistake he made. However, the way he governs the Spider Society is highly questionable. He becomes the antithesis of one of the first film's core messages, that every Spider-Man is different and there's no real way to be Spider-Man. Miguel becomes like an authoritarian dictator, enforcing his belief as law, like Benito Mussolini or Kylian Mbappe. Miguel tightens his grip on control so much that he believes that any deviation from the canon might result in the death of a reality, so he leads the other Spider People to believe the same. And this mirrors how men tend to blame themselves immensely for guilt. Men typically hold themselves to high expectations and, like Miguel, tend not to be so forgiving of themselves even if there was no real ill intention. Miguel even says, "All this time, I am the only one who's been holding it all together." And that just illustrates how much guilt he's been harboring and how much responsibility he's taken upon himself. And I believe that's something that a lot of men feel, that if you loosen your grip, even just a little, everything might fall apart. But the thing is, Miguel is not necessarily wrong. When entire dimensions are falling apart seemingly because one specific scene is prevented from playing out, I would also think twice about interfering with these so-called canon events. Miguel is fundamentally trying to save lives, and I think he's as well-intentioned as any other superhero, but his problem lies in the fact that he's approaching the canon events in a rather one-dimensional manner. His guilt and fear of losing another dimension is clouding his judgment because he knows that breaking the canon would result in the destruction of a universe, but he doesn't question why that is. If they're even a real thing, who decides what is or isn't canon? Why does breaking them seemingly cause entire dimensions to crumble? And if these so-called canon events are real, how come the dimension where the spider that bit Miles, Earth 42, still exists? If canon events, shared experiences that every spider person has to go through, are vital to the existence of a spider person's dimension, how come the spider that bit Miles getting yeeted to another dimension wasn't enough of a canon event disruption to cause the decimation of Earth 42? And since we know how Miles deals with people trying to control him, he, of course, rebels against Miguel and the Spider Society. But he couldn't have done it without the help of the next character, Hobie Brown. Hobie is by far my favorite character from the second film, and that's a very high bar considering what they gave us. But the interesting thing about all the men in the universe that we've talked about so far is that all of them have an obsession with labels. Miles is obsessed with proving that he's Spider-Man, Jeff is obsessed with proving that he's a good father, Aaron wants to remain the cool uncle, Captain Stacy is the good cop, and Miguel is the leader of the Spider Society. And these characters and these films in general reflect how in real life men put a lot of emphasis on labels. Because to men, labels give status. And status means money, influence, women, and a lot more. For example, being perceived as alpha and being part of the top 10% of men has become so important to young men especially. But the thing with labels is that they can never truly define a person. All of these characters have a label and all of them are so much more than their respective labels. And maybe that's why Hobie is rather famously against labels. At first, it's a throwaway line, but it also represents how some men choose to not be defined by words, but how they live according to their values. Hobie is a rebellious character. He pushes back against control, especially if he doesn't align with the values of those attempting to control him. Even his animation style compared to the other characters is so wild. And it takes a certain level of confidence and security to reject labels, because when everyone defines themselves by what they label themselves as, being undefined makes you dangerous. And Hobie is okay with being perceived as that. Rather ironically, Hobie's masculinity comes from him rejecting his need for status, as we see him literally leaving the Spider Society that Miles has spent about a third of the film trying to get into. What makes Hobie so masculine, or in his words, man-like, is that he lives not according to labels and status, but according to his own values, even if those conflict with those around him. That's why he's the only spider person to help Miles escape, which I can't even say for Peter B or Gwen. Hobie claims that he isn't a role model, but he's also a character that a lot of men might want to aspire to be like, because Hobie is an admirable male character, because in a world that demands men to be alpha and exceptional, Hobie is comfortable being himself. And before I end the video, there's one character that represents the perfect opposite of Hobie, a character who is so obsessed with labels to the point that it seemingly drives him mad. And I'm talking about the Spot. The Spot is the perfect villain because in a universe where the male characters are so obsessed with labels and identity, the Spot represents what happens when men place too much weight on these titles. We see that the Spot is at first rather pathetic. He can barely control his powers and he can't even accomplish a simple ATM jacking. Even his backstory is laughable. He's the guy who gets hit by a bagel in the first film, and when he becomes the Spot, he's rejected by society. Thus, he turns to a life of villainy. He claims to be Miles' nemesis, and he internalizes this so much that when Miles brushes him off as a villain of the week, this becomes his motivation to seek more power and exact revenge on the kid. The Spot's ego has been so bruised by Miles' judgment of him that he's willing to go to extreme lengths in the name of revenge, hopping from universe to universe, gathering power to eventually take everything from Miles. The Spot is a fascinating villain because he's not bent on world domination, the destruction of universes, or boundless wealth, because he probably understands that he has access to all of these things if he just learned how to use his powers properly. But what he chases is respect. All the Spot wants is respect from Miles as an adversary for him to validate him as his nemesis. And there's nothing wrong with wanting respect. In a lot of ways, to be respected and seen as competent is a deeply human desire. But in chasing that respect, the Spot becomes increasingly powerful to take revenge on the teenager whose words made him feel bad. And this is what makes Miles and the Spot perfect parallels to each other, because both characters are deeply insecure about who they are after crazy events disrupted their lives forever. But the Spot lets the world define his identity. He's branded as a villain, so he becomes one. He's branded as a weak one, so he goes out of his way to prove that he isn't. While on the other hand, Miles realizes that his identity is his own to write. Both of these characters ask who they are, but answer that same question in two completely different ways, and I think that's whack.